this part of the competition, you are taking on a fictional business identity and assigning a fictional business identity to the judges. Please make sure everyone knows who you are and who they are before you begin. You will have 25 minutes with a 5-minute cushion to describe the legal, financial, and ethical dimensions of the problem, and to recommend a solution that passes muster on all 3 counts. During this time, teams will be uninterrupted. When you are finished, the judges will ask you questions for 20 minutes. During the Q&A, both you and the judges stay in character. After the Q&A, the judges will give you feedback outside the role play. Some important things to keep in mind. The ethical aspects of your analysis are the most important part. However, these should be described in a simple, practical, common sense fashion. Using technical, philosophical terminology or basing your argument on religious or theological grounds will be considered a serious weakness. Similarly, any members of the team reading his or her part will also be considered a major mistake, although you may use notes. During this presentation, every member of the team must have some sort of speaking role. You knew all that?
Yes.
You know all that now? Questions? Concerns? Well then...
So I think I know how to work it, so whenever we...
Sorry? Oh, yeah.
I think I do.
1, 2, 3, push.
Good morning. We would like to thank you for inviting us to speak to you today in relation to the recent dispute which you, as the Board of Directors of Apple, faced against the FBI. My name is Alicia Pshenichny.
I'm Ryan Burns.
I'm Victoria Marford, and I'm Zach Tripp.
December 2nd, 2015. What began as a work celebration soon turned tragic. All it took was 2 to 3 minutes for 2 shooters with terrorist ties to carry out the deadliest terrorist attack on U.S. soil since 9/11, killing 14 and injuring 22 others. The following days and weeks were very chaotic, but at one point, the FBI finds the main shooter's iPhone and comes to you, Apple, demanding to have it be unlocked. Will the FBI take a bite out of the apple? During today's presentation, we will begin by discussing the San Bernardino tragedy. We will then analyze current laws within the United States in relation to the encryption legislation. We will then discuss international implications and your corporate mission and structure, ending with how we believe that you, as the Board of Directors of Apple, should proceed moving forward in case similar issues arise in the future. Sang will now discuss the San Bernardino tragedy.
After the shooting, the FBI was able to recover the shooter's iPhone 5C, which was issued by his former employer. FBI agents reset the phone's iCloud account, and so were able to access the information stored online. However, weeks before the shooting, the phone stopped syncing with the cloud service, and so potential evidence remained on the phone. The FBI needed Apple's help to write and upload a code onto the device that will allow FBI software to test all possible combinations of the password without triggering the phone to delete its content after 10 tries. The FBI sought to compel Apple's cooperation by invoking the All Writs Act. Apple refused, citing grave privacy concerns as well as worries that this would set a dangerous precedent for the case. In his testimony to Congress, FBI Director James Comey stated that end-to-end encryption effectively rendered many devices warrant-proof. Since only the person who has access to the password can access the device, investigators have no way of getting information despite possession of a valid search warrant. Director Comey cited many companies that were able to protect their data, but in a format that could still aid in investigations. Apple representatives, however, stated that such a tool, once created, could be used repeatedly to undermine the concept of security. Even though the FBI asked for only one phone to be unlocked in this instance, Director Comey admitted that the FBI could potentially ask for future help. To resolve the situation, the FBI approached a third party to help them unlock the phone. The FBI reportedly paid over $1 million for hackers to exploit a previously unknown flaw of the software. The FBI did not release any information on the vulnerability that they were able to exploit. By keeping it a secret, they could use it in future cases, unlocking other iPhone 5Cs. As the Justice Department was satisfied with the compromise here, they asked the court to vacate the order forcing Apple's participation. And since the case was never resolved in court, this leaves room for future legislation on the issue. Ryan will now discuss the current laws as it applies to the security and privacy debate.
Let's examine all the applicable existing laws surrounding the case. This issue, or the unprecedented of this issue, magnifies when you consider the heaviest cited legislation dates back to the 18th century. The All Writs Act of 1789 cites that the Supreme Court and all courts established by Congress may issue all writs necessary to aid in their respective jurisdictions under principles of law. Very vague. To clarify a little bit, a writ in today's language is a formal written order issued by a competent authority commanding a party to whom it is addressed to do or not to do something. So in this case, a federal judge from California is commanding Apple to design a backdoor for the FBI. Now, although there is no direct precedence, this is not the first telephone-related case involving the All Writs Act. In 2005, the Department of Justice tried to justify tracking someone's location using their cell phone without search warrant or statute enforcement using the All Writs Act. The judge rejected the request. He clearly deemed it unethical for the government to monitor its citizens when unwarranted. Here, a privacy intrusion was victorious against the All Writs Act. A court case from 1977 called the U.S. versus the New York Telephone Company, which is a utility company, keep in mind, will be discussed later. But just briefly, the government requested that the company assist in installing fake pen registers. The government cited the All Writs Act, which was verified by the Supreme Court. The court ruled that compliance with the search warrant required minimal effort on behalf of the company and would cause no disruption to its operations. It was not requesting a unique, never-before-done process. It would be both reasonable and ethical to comply with the request, as the company frequently changes and installs wires. When has Apple ever installed a backdoor? It never has. Now consider the impact of the request itself. Essentially, this ruling would have set the precedent. Then what? Apple CEO Tim Cook points out the horrors best by saying, if the government can use the All Writs Act to make it easier to unlock your iPhone, then what's stopping them from reaching into anyone's device and capturing their data? Now, the next act we have is the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986, which limits the power of the government to access private information of its citizens. The act prohibits the unauthorized interception of communications by any third party. Congress sought to protect the privacy of its citizens. The next act we have is the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, which provides a better median for government surveillance. The act requires telecommunication carriers to ensure their equipment, facilities, and services all meet certain guidelines set out by the act that enable government surveillance. Now, the key part of that definition is telecommunication carriers. Apple does not meet that specification. The Department of Justice recognized the growth of internet-based communication companies a few years ago and tried to expand CALEA to include them. They were not successful. Had they been successful, Apple would have needed to design a backdoor access that the government could utilize for surveillance. They were not. Therefore, Apple remains on the outskirts of the jurisdiction. Furthermore, the act did not outlaw encryption, which Apple customers use for security. The last act we have is the Senate Joint Resolution 34, which was just recently passed through Congress and enacted into law. It nullifies a previously created law by the FCC, which protected customers of broadband and telecommunication carriers. Customers can no longer opt in or out of sharing their data. Companies can no now sell customers' information to advertisers without their consent. Now, while this doesn't directly relate to the San Bernardino case, it does exemplify the government entering and dictating the privacy versus security debate. Now, with that said, the Congress has not developed any new legislation to solve the problem. In April, the Obama administration refused to support any legislation, and in May, after House support vanished, momentum for new legislation was killed. We will discuss what you as Apple Board should do in shaping legislation later in the presentation, especially from an ethical standpoint. And I'll turn things over to Victoria, who will talk about past privacy versus security cases.
Apple's refusal to create a backdoor access for the FBI to use on the iPhone recovered after the San Bernardino attack is not the first instance of privacy versus security. Apple, along with other tech companies, have been arguing similar cases within the courts for several years. In most situations, the Silicon Valley has willingly complied to these requests. Apple regularly receives information requests. However, less than 0.00612% of Apple's customers are affected. The FBI has tried to use the 1977 Supreme Court case, United States versus the New York Telephone Company, as an argument to force Apple's hand. This case is extremely outdated and could only resemble a highly simplistic version of our current situation. The outcome of the case ruled in favor of the FBI. However, the ruling was based on a three-part test that determined the telephone company to be not so far removed from the facts of the case. The telephone company is a public utility, and the requested help from the FBI was termed meager. The FBI had exhausted all other means of completing the surveillance without any success. On the other hand, Apple, in our situation, is an independent company that is so far removed from the facts of the case. The requested help from the FBI is hardly meager, but an unprecedented and oppressive burden on Apple. The FBI has demonstrated how they did not have other means, or they could have went around Apple. They did go around Apple, as they did in the San Bernardino case. They requested the help from Apple, but did not really need it, even though they requested the help first. Our next case is the Brooklyn case, which is a more recent and relevant case between the FBI and Apple. This case happened in the early months of 2016. The court rulings in this case sided with Apple, declaring that the All Rights Act is unnecessary and expensive. The U.S. Magistrate Judge James Ornstein, he actually accused Apple of blatantly sidestepping Congress to secure crypto legislative authority through the courts. Apple has been more than accommodating in the past by adhering to the information request of the FBI. However, now the FBI is crossing the line and demanding too much from Apple. Brian will now talk about Simon will now talk about the international implications.
Sorry. The UN designates privacy as a human right in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Articles 19. It's also seen in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Over 130 countries have protection of privacy somewhere in their constitution. Over 100 countries have data protection laws in place, with the European Union having the strongest and most comprehensive legislation. However, variations in coverage means that there are many situations in which your data is not protected. The abstract nature of privacy makes it easy to leave out a debate about security. So, this leaves room for dire human rights abuses. For example, it was reviewed, Edward Snowden reviewed through leaked documents that the United States was conducting a program of mass surveillance on many people via the NSA and an internal intelligence apparatus. Those who had access to the security apparatus suffered little or no legal oversight. as to how they use their the tool. Similar programs like this exist all over the world, and many of which leads to even worse human rights abuses. In the age of globalization, national security has become increasingly important for every nation. The modern measure of security involves the monitoring of individuals as well as nations. This means that to many, privacy does translate directly to security. For example, protesters all across the Middle East, as well as in other areas where freedom of speech is heavily regulated, are able to use end-to-end encryption to bypass local censorship laws, as well as to protect their privacy as they organize protests against their government. Privacy and security ultimately is only possible when the rule of law applies evenly to all, and especially to those who wield power. Alicia will now discuss the future of legislation on these issues.
The encryption war, however, is not over. In fact, if anything, it is more urgent than ever before. If the FBI really wanted to win, then they shouldn't have brought you to the courts. By doing so, they started a conversation that Americans have been putting off for years. By starting this conversation, the flame has been ignited, and many governmental officials have begun to create new legislation surrounding encryption, which would favor the government in the future. Now, these new legislative guidances are being created because, as Ryan stated, the current laws date back to the 1700s, back when telephones didn't even exist. Now, the Compliance with Court Orders Act has been proposed, which is a 9-page draft of legislature, which ultimately states that all individuals and companies must provide the government with unlocked data under a court order. This essentially aims to outlaw encryption altogether, because it doesn't say anything about backdoor access, but rather that information must already be provided unlocked. And if Apple succumbs to this vulnerability, then it will just be an open target, and everyone will want a part of it. Once people know that backdoor access actually exists, hackers will attempt to utilize that. In addition, terrorists will simply use other means of communication to bypass that. Other bills have been enacted which ultimately preempt states from creating their own anti-encryption legislature, which gives all the power to the federal government to create all the laws surrounding every single issue. Now, the problem is that there cannot be any shades of gray. This isn't a one-time instance. Moving forward, the problem is that Congress and the Senate do not have that technological expertise to create a law which applies to every single scenario. Therefore, we recommend as one of our solutions that you provide at least one representative who is skilled in the area of technological expertise to be a part of the building and shaping of encryption legislation. By doing this, you will be the first major company to show that you balance your customers' need for privacy along with the growing need for security. Victoria will now take us through your corporate mission and structure.
Apple will always prioritize its customers. As Cook put it, Apple is a staunch advocate for consumer privacy and personal safety. The FBI has argued that Apple is trying to secure their brand rather than wanting to help. However, we all know that by providing this access to the FBI, that there will be a severe breach of consumer trust. Essentially, the government is asking you to undermine decades of security advancement, which you have prided yourself on. The Electronic Frontier Foundation has awarded Apple 5 out of 5 stars on their Who Has Your Back report, commending Apple on their strong stance regarding privacy, transparency, and user rights. Now you may be thinking that you have taken such a strong stance on protecting these rights in the past and that what we are proposing may go back on what you have stood for. However, change is necessary, and we believe Apple should be at the forefront of the process. The process should be presented as a change or a shift in strategy to get ahead of legislation. Apple's mission statement even points to the fact that your company has the self-honesty to admit when wrong and the ability and courage to change. At the Apple's core is its customers, so we need to best protect them and put them first. Ryan will now talk about the past security breaches of Apple.
Apple has been a wall of garden when it comes to security, especially when compared to Android. With that said, Apple has faltered in some instances. For example, within iOS 6, users were able to bypass passcode restrictions by going through the phone's camera or through Siri. Within iOS 7, emails were not being properly encrypted, which left all the attachments and information vulnerable. For the iPhone 5S, a passcode thumbprint feature was added, but within 18 hours, hackers were able to fake another person's thumbprint and enter their phone. With each of these instances, Apple released iOS updates as soon as they were feasible and apologized for the error. Now with shutdowns, and that issue occurred a couple years ago with iPhone 5s and later, where users that set their phone time to January 1st, 1970 and restarted their phone had the software crash and fail to reload. Now you might be asking why someone would ever do that. A fake ad circulated on the internet saying that once a user did that, a retro Apple logo would appear on the restart, but that clearly wasn't the case. Any phone that suffered the damage could be brought to the Genius Bar and fixed. And Apple released an iOS update that prevented the issue from happening in the future. The last issue is spyware. Apple desktop computers succumbed to a sophisticated spyware attack where hackers were able to spy on the users. This also infected the devices of any connected iPhones or iPods. Apple released an iOS update that solved that issue as well and apologized. Clearly, Apple values the security of its customers. You work tirelessly and timely to ensure that any issues are resolved. You emphasize updating with the iOS operating systems as soon as updates are made available. You have also implemented better controls. For example, users now have the ability to enter longer passcodes than the standard 4-digit one. Users now have to enter their Apple ID and password to either erase or reactivate their device. Users also can now dictate on an apply basis what location tracking services they would like on or off. So Apple undergoes these security measures not only to protect the security of their customers, but also to avoid negative impacts felt by stakeholder perception of the company. Now I will pass things over to Alicia, who will finish off with our recommendation.
We just want to stress that you do not have any current legal obligation to provide the FBI with any information. And according to your corporate mission and structure, you acted in the best interest of all of your stakeholders. However, looking forward, we just want to ensure that you are best equipped to handle issues in case something similar arises in the future. Now, just to put things into perspective, a Pew Research study conducted showed that 51% of respondents said that they agreed with FBI, whereas 49% said that they agreed with you, Apple. In a similar study conducted by Reuters, the results showed that 46% of respondents said that they agreed with you, whereas only 35% said that they did not. This clearly shows that there was a divide down the middle, and as a result, Apple did not suffer any financial or brand impact. However, you don't look to profits as making your decision because you truly value your customers. But this does show that people did disagree with your decision. Imagine if on September 10th, 2001, you had created backdoor access which had allowed you to stop the 9/11 attacks. How would that have impacted the future? Although it's difficult to anticipate the future, we must ultimately ask the question, what constitutes something as being important enough to look into? In the case versus the FBI, was the conclusion that the dangers to the American people were not as severe as the dangers to your customers' privacy? Therefore, looking forward, we believe that instead of taking a software approach to creating backdoor access, we believe that it should instead be a hardware backdoor access. By doing so, the software access would provide hackers with the easier ability to hack into your systems. Now, we understand that even if it's a hardware encryption like access, there still will be risks posed, and hackers will attempt to get into it. But our strategy includes the fact that you would take off the back of the iPhone, and there would be a chip inside, which is strategically placed in a way that only Apple truly knows how to get rid of it without deleting all of the information on it. Now, hackers in the future will attempt to bypass that. But if the FBI comes up with another instance of national security like this, they won't want to risk all of that data being destroyed, so they will come to you, Apple. In relation to answering the question of what constitutes something as being important enough to look into, we recommend that you create an algorithm or a formula which takes into consideration all of your stakeholders and weighs them appropriately based on a risk analysis scale. That decision will ultimately be made through that algorithm. But we also understand that not every ethical question can be answered by a machine or by a formula. Therefore, we also recommend creating a secret committee of experts who will make the final unanimous decision on each case-by-case basis. This committee will consist of a former prosecutor, a corporate social responsibility expert, and an expert in technology. By utilizing this strategy, you will truly show that you value your customers' privacy, but you're moving ahead and showing that you care about the overall security of the world. Now, this debate may have been made out to be about privacy versus security, but looking forward, you must understand that the power is truly in utilizing both at the same time. You have shown that you do not act strictly for your profits, but rather for your customers. We would like to thank you for listening to our recommendations today. As the most profitable and influential company in the world, you have the ability to implement various changes. Therefore, the actions that you take as a company will not go unnoticed. You have the ability to set the precedent in a world filled with technological advancement to show that you truly value your customers and the growing need for security worldwide, thus ultimately answering the ethical dilemma of valuing privacy versus security. Thank you. Are there any questions?
So you did some polling of, I'm not sure if that was Apple users or just Americans in general on how they felt if you sided with FBI versus Apple. But I'd like to see the numbers if you have those on what the Apple customers said in regards to this debate. How many were in favor of providing information to the FBI versus protecting their data? Do you have that?
Well, I can answer that. So we don't have the exact statistics, but we did. They were aged 18 to 42, and it was Apple users and non-Apple users. It was a variety of people, both male, female. And the questions asked were, did you agree with the ultimate decision? And that was the simple question. Now, further analysis showed that when people were questioned, like secondarily after that, the respondents said they were asked why. And they were some people who said that they supported Apple's stance or stance. They said that they just agreed simply with the issue at hand. They don't want their information provided to the general public. However, when asked, well, what if something like 9/11 occurs? They do change their opinion in a slight way. That's why it's important that in our solution, we realize that there could be, in this case, we got lucky and nothing was on the phone. But what if something like 9/11 happens again and Apple could have provided that backdoor access? How will the company suffer? Ethically, financially, everything.
Just briefly, what a mixed survey we believe also kind of shows is not only do we want to get the opinion of Apple's own customers, but potential customers or maybe customers that switched. Was that part of the reason? So I think that getting a broader sense, of course you would want what your own customers say on the issue, but from a stakeholder perspective, the community remains a big part.
So as board members, and this is my last question, but as board members, it's in our best interest to maximize the shareholder value of the company and doing so in an ethical manner. What I did not see were the financial impacts. to what's the financial impact for supporting the FBI versus supporting our shareholders, how that looks over a 5-year horizon or so. How is that going to impact the bottom line?
Well, we discussed briefly that right after the incident, there was no financial impact. That's because it was split down the middle. It truly was 50-50. There was no impact on we looked at the stock values, there was no impact. And on the brand image as well. Customers still stayed with Apple. Nobody really switched over just because of this instance. But in the future, that could happen. And that's why we are recommending this, because in the future, financially, that could be a major impact. If something like a terrorist attack happens, and let's say I'm a customer of Apple, I will truly value the company less if it doesn't provide that backdoor software. There are instances where that's required, in my opinion, and in an ethical standpoint. And that's why we are trying to make sure that Apple's not financially impacted by that.
Well, I'm concerned about our ability to market our product. And if people in the world think that when they buy an Apple phone, anybody can listen to them, how did they buy an Apple phone? Do you have any data that surveys the marketability of phones?
So are you looking at it from like a government surveillance perspective, or just from like what users would think?
Customers trust for the security of the phone.
Well,
It's not a secure phone, it's a trash can. Why would they buy it?
ultimately not. There's flaws in every phone software. That's why there is $1 million black market industry entirely based on exploiting these software, which the FBI took use of. So, in a sense, there's no such thing as a totally secure device. By implementing this hardware change, we're the only one able to access the phone through our proprietary technology, as opposed to a software solution where anybody can have access. And the risk of hacking is always there. And so, from a security perspective, we can argue that this does not impact the likelihood of the security breach within the phone. This simply allows Apple itself to access the information on the phone and no one else. So.
Additionally, Apple has built this reputation, as I talked about, their decades worth of technological and security advancements. By holding off, how you have done through the San Bernardino attack, and you're standing on your own, you're showing that you have that thinking where you are for the consumer, and you took a step back and you want to evaluate all that before going in and making this decision. Now we feel like it's time to step up and be proactive, and being proactive where for the past several years other tech companies shy away from this subject. It's going to actually create a better image for Apple, because you want to be a part of the process rather than just hiding in the shadows or allowing instances to just occur. You want to be on the front of it.
And that was demonstrated with all the issues that I brought up about security breaches, encryption, etc. Every time Apple released very timely and very publicly the resolution, how they came to it, and why this occurred. And we believe that that kind of proactivity should be how Apple responds within our solution also.
And also, if I could just add one point, basically with the new legislation which is attempting to be enacted, we're trying to push ahead of that in order for that legislation to not actually happen. And the new legislation would ultimately create backdoor. It would say that either way, backdoor is going to exist. Because if the government says that companies and individuals must provide that information unlocked, then there's a backdoor there. So either way, backdoors will exist. But our solution is that we keep it within our own control, within Apple's control, exclusively, so that the government doesn't have that, and therefore it's not all public.
What assurance do we have that the hardware solution will remain within Apple's control? And I cite to you examples. The telephone company, the blue boxes, have been using for decades now to bypass the telephone company controls. That's part of what signals and decoding their signals. They have hardware in both instances. They're outside the control of the operator.
I'll make a little point, but basically, under that sense, as we've discussed, there's always going to be hackers who are attempting to get into everything, whether it's Apple, Microsoft, Android, whatever it is. There's hackers. That's their everyday job. So whatever exists, that's why there are the software updates, because there's a fault somewhere. There will be continuous faults, but we want Apple to stay ahead of that. So if there is a major breach of that and people do hack into that, there's the next step. Apple has always provided that next step. So why in the future would that ever be an issue as well, is our standpoint.
And also, we believe that Apple should be taking the proactive approach. And so having our own backdoor as well as lobbying and making sure that Congress is aware of our stance on things, we can be ahead of the any legislation on this issue. Because given say a catastrophic event happens, public opinion would turn against Apple, and giving lawmakers a lot of authority to enact laws that could potentially impact you as the board members of Apple. And because these laws can compel Apple to have data unencrypted at all times in order to be provided to aid investigations and such. And so part of our solution is that, yes, there is a slight risk in possible hacks of our hardware. However, our software is constantly being tested by even the NSA. And so having this hardware at least gives us a measure of control over how we can help in the investigation, as opposed to having our hands forced by a court order or by Congress.
Also, that risk is already there. It's been there, like hackers, it's a whole industry. So what we are proposing will help Apple stay ahead of it. And Apple has always been on their toes, as they always put out those iOS updates. And it's like a continuous process. There's no endpoint. There's no stop, because hackers will not stop. But the point is that your company has strongly been on protecting their customers, and that will continue to flow for the company.
I may not be fully understanding something, so you can set me straight, but is it possible that your solution could backfire? And what I mean by that is, by getting proactive and trying to get an Apple mind into the legislation process, you run the risk always of losing. I mean, it may not turn out that the solution that we propose is accepted by the legislator, the writing of the legislation. But what will have happened is we will have participated, and therefore we wouldn't have much appeal in the way we might if we didn't participate. So I'm wondering whether there could be some unintended consequences of that proactivity also seems to imply consent to whatever happens, because it's not control that we're exercising, but a voice.
No, we agree with that, but the fact of the matter is, our solution is being proposed because we believe that proactivity is necessary from a company like you, because you're the fastest growing company, the most profitable. If anyone's going to look up to anyone, it would be you. So in an ultimate fashion, if during the legislative process, they're creating these laws, they have no technological background, they have no knowledge. How are they supposed to create one law which applies to every scenario? Ultimately, they'll create a law that will have loopholes, and more court orders will have to follow after that. Why not try to attempt to create one act of legislature which would over-encompass every single scenario, or attempt to? We understand that it could backfire, or they could not agree, but that ultimately comes to coming up with something where both parties benefit. I think you understand the fact that the government's not simply going to say, okay, you're right, you should hold your own power. But you are giving them that accessibility. They want it in the case of security issues, so they can have that if it's important enough. And I think you value that. So that's our ultimate stance, and we think that proactivity is important.
And I think from like the main point we're trying to drive across here is perception. Because no matter what we propose, what you decide, there's always going to be a backfire scenario. Say that Apple decides not to go with the ethical standpoint, holds out, and then a September 11th like issue occurs, that public perception could potentially run very much significantly worse than say like the certain San Bernardino. But it's almost like a double-edged sword in that sense.
We also believe that in lobbying Congress and in putting our voice into the debate, we can advocate for our consumers as well as the privacy of the citizens of the United States. And so I don't think that public perception could be bad in that sense, because we're helping to play devil's advocate to the need for ever increasing security measures, because right now Congress has favors stricter laws that would help protect national security, and in the name of national security, a lot of things can be enacted, and if we can advocate for privacy rights as well as security rights, we can help steer legislation to a more acceptable middle ground, as opposed to some extreme measure that would value security much highly over privacy.
And one last point, the problem is currently people within the United States don't trust the government, especially after all that information was leaked, as Sang discussed with Snowden. They don't trust the government, so that's why so many respondents were happy with Apple's solution and decision, because they don't want the government having that accessibility. They trust you, but they don't trust the government.
So I'm concerned about the argument of causation, that if there is another security incident, that because we have protected privacy, we are somehow culpable for that incident. And this link here is concerning me, because I believe that one does not happen for the other. And if we provide a backdoor, that is a detective control after. It is not a preventative control. So that's my one concern. And then also this, we'll get to they trust us. So why should we be getting in bed with the government just to help their legislative progression? So twofold, I know, but.
Well, to answer the second part, I don't know if you guys have the answer to the first part, but to get ahead of that, as you said, to help the government, it's because you want to take an ethical standpoint and move ahead of the game. Because if something like that did happen, then you want to have the laws not favoring you, but have a clear, concise answer. Currently, they're not building legislature. That's why it's been years, and they're proposing bill after bill, but nothing makes sense because it does not create like one solution for every single scenario. If you have that representative, it will ultimately increase your brand and impact, because although Apple has never really taken a part of the political standpoint, it's important that pushing that, it's not necessarily political, but you're trying to ethically advance society and make sure that everyone is protected in a secure fashion.
But I think we have taken a stand. And by protecting the data and asking them to come to us in a legitimate fashion on an per-instance basis, that is our stance. So what you're asking us to do now is to subvert that, to go in and to help create legislation that could be flawed, or we could lose that sense of what we've already stood for, which is our customers' biggest privacy.
Well, the legislature would ultimately, we'd be trying to do that ahead of creating the second solution. We want to make sure that we are able to create that solution. So first, it would have to begin at the Senate and Congress, and that would have to be quick because they are trying to create that 9-page draft of legislature, which basically just takes away all of your rights and says you have to provide that information without a lock. So attempting to either change that slightly, give you some flexibility, and give you power as a company to hold something within yourself gives you that ability.
And also, when we do attempt to influence legislation, we should try to support legislation that would protect privacy as opposed to expand the intelligence capabilities. And so, by recommending helping legislature, what we need to do is to steer the conversation away from what we can, to steer it back towards the protection of privacy as opposed to letting the hysteria and fear drive the conversation towards matters of national security. Which brings me back to your first question, because even though that is not a causal link that getting into the iPhone would prevent such a thing, but we believe that helping, if we could help review information that could prevent a future attack, and should that future attack occur, and any investigation that could point to the fact that maybe our lack of cooperation has helped the identities of terrorists or some blueprint from showing up, from being uncovered, then we could easily be blamed. Because when it comes to matters of national security, Americans are very fearful of another terrorist attack. And so by playing on those fears, legislators as well as prosecutors can sway public opinions away from trusting us and into hysteria, essentially. Because after a catastrophic incident, there's a lot of finger pointing. And we don't want to be at the end of that finger, essentially. So it's not a causal thing, but we do want to prevent.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Any further questions from the judges? Enroll. Well, thank you very much. And we'll end this period of role play, and I welcome the judges to say what they would like to say about the presentation in general, and we'll take about 10 minutes if we need it for that.
So I understand why you guys had a simplistic view on your charge. You kept it simple because you wanted our focus to be on the presenter. However, you presented a technically complicated, it's a complex situation and problem. You're going over the different laws. You're talking about some technical solutions. So for me, it would have been nice to see like at least 1 or 2 points on each on the slide, not necessarily a long sentence or a paragraph, but 1 or 2 words that can jog my memory, because now I can go back to listen to what you're saying, but I can also glance over, oh, okay, this is the ECPA Act. Okay, I get it. There's something to kind of jog my memory. Also, I know this is the first case of its kind on American soil with the FBI trying to gain access to the Apple system, but has anything similarly happened with the Android system overseas and what Google did to comply with those authorities overseas? So I kind of think about that as well. And my last point, are you guys familiar with the Palantir program? So I have a company, and we do reverse engineering for the government and provide top secret information on a particular country. Palantir is a program, I think some of the founders are Peter Thiel from Google, and it's basically a big data compilation, and companies like Google and other American companies provide information, and it's actually operated by the CIA, and that's public record, but I would also ask, is Apple part of that program as well? So when we talk about ethical views and how they're going to protect the customer, are they also doing things on the back end that they don't think anyone actually knows about, doing it for the sake of national security? So had that in mind.
It's maybe a small nit to pick, but when you started out and introduced us as the board, you forgot to introduce who you are and what your role was here. So I wasn't sure if you were going to end with a Salle or a vibe. So just a little bit.
I thought the presentation skills were very good. Some smoothness that could be improved by rehearsal. But overall, the way you set up the room, did that was very well. I think this is a values issue. And I don't think I heard the values of the Apple company highlighted at any time. And so I think that in order to persuade us to move in a particular direction, we really need to come down hard on the values of the company and what we need to do to support those values. And it may be that we need to update our values. Maybe they're not complete enough. Maybe there's some other value that we need to put in there. In your particular case, you're arguing that we need to do something for stakeholders that are broader than our customer base because it's a question of national defense. And so we may need to go into that arena. And that was missing from the argument. So I would say values would be a good place to focus on this.
I thought the presentation was very good, but you would improve it even more if you had maybe a note card or something, because it was evident that you had committed to memory your part of the presentation, and the memory can play tricks on you. You're asked not to read your presentation, obviously, but if you had a note card that could help you over a memory blip, it would probably increase your confidence in the presentation. So because the more you think about, am I going to remember all this, the less likely it is that you will. So that's just a presentational observation. Yeah, I want to expand a little on the values point that Carl just made. There's a certain kind of equivocation in this, and it's probably because there's an equivocation in real life between treasuring the privacy of your customers and protecting your brand for profit purposes. I mean, unhappy customers mean less revenue, and so if the equivocation is we're doing this out of an ethical devotion to our customers, but there's a financial devotion going on here too. And if a certain number of your customers decide to find another vendor, then so when you place the argument in the context of ethics, when I had my antenna up listening for ethics observations from you, an ethical argument from you, it's always got a certain kind of equivocation about it. Now, I'm not suggesting that it would be, one would hope that an ethical solution was also a financially viable solution. I'm not suggesting they have to disagree. But there is this sense of, well, is the ethics of the matter the dominant reason, or is the finances the dominant reason? The ethical is the caboose. And you might want to think about that in future presentations, especially the 10-minute presentations tomorrow, because there you're being asked to really zoom in on the ethics part. And I would encourage you to think through, what is the real guts of your argument on the ethical front. But thank you so much. Other judges have any further comments?
No, I think Kate deserves some applause.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very
Thank you
nice
guys so
meeting
much.
you.
It's nice to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice to meet you.
Thank you very much. It was nice meeting you. Thank you very much.
But unfortunately, I have to take my laptop.
Yes. Hopefully